Good morning.
Hello, Dr. Cocchiola. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Can you hear me okay?
hmm Can you hear me?
Great. I can. Yeah, it's so great to meet you. I'm Billy Terrasio. I am a family law attorney, owner of Modern Law. You are a professor and an expert on coercive control. I am so excited to kind of dive in with you and also take some of the audience Q&A. So before we get started, would you mind just telling people a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, gosh, where to begin? I started doing this work at the age of 19. I really wanted to be an advocate for victims and survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault. I worked in child welfare and worked in public schools, and then became an educator on the college level and a clinician. And then I went on and got my doctorate in clinical social welfare after I divorced a coercive controller after being married for an extended period of time. So I think the story is that I was educating on this topic every single semester. I've been doing the work since I was 19. I'm a clinician, and I didn't even know it was happening in my own home.
What?
So that's the point about coercive control, right? Is that we really are, we have to stop looking at the archaic model of the violent incident model, because domestic abuse is not about violence. Violence happens, but that's when the coercive controller has literally lost all ability to control. And so they use violence as sometimes, unfortunately, the final act, but certainly as an act to exert more power and control. So I didn't have violence, and I really, I had been taught the violent incident model, and we have legislation in basically 45 states that only looks at the violent incident model. So it's not a lie to say that most people, if they don't have a bruise, they honestly can't put their finger on it. They really don't know what's happening to them. And I'm proof of that. So there we go. That's my intro. I'm a protective parent also. Children who grow up in these family systems are victims of the coercive controller, hands down, no doubt about it. So
Got it. Okay, Kendra, did you say we're not live?
Yes, so we are not currently up on Facebook. We do have somebody trying to enter. We have a couple people trying to enter. I believe they're guests attempting to watch the live.
Okay, so let's see. I can push it again from Zoom. Oh no,
That was a great.
I know it was great. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, it says from Zoom that we are live streaming. And I can see on the Modern Divorce or on the Modern Law page that we are live. Do you want to check again?
Yeah, let me see. Because we have 4 people right now waiting to join.
Well, we can absolutely let them in 100%. But I do want to make sure that our page is getting this.
So the join event is directing them to this Zoom meeting.
Okay.
So do you want to let them in? I don't know how many people it'll let in at one time.
Oh yeah, you can let everybody in, force mute them. We'll unmute them in order to ask questions.
Okay.
And I'm just going to leave it live, and we're just going to go with it.
Cool.
Okay, so Dr. Cocchiola, you are so correct that the law does follow the physical violence model. That is what is illegal. So it doesn't mean that people haven't experienced domestic abuse. People have, and children do, and it literally doesn't impact their family law case. And what I love so much about what you do is you go beyond that to say, but there are things you can do as a protective parent. So let's talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think that that's the key, right? Is that so often victims and survivors don't even know they're living in this experience, because there is so much, part of coercive control. It's an umbrella term, but there is psychological abuse, right? There's this, gaslighting, manipulation, intimidation, isolation. And so if you don't know you're living in it, what I always say to protective moms is that if you didn't know and then you left, and it often gets so much worse. 90% of the time it gets worse post separation. And so the coercive controller is going to exert more power and control. And they're always like, why are my children upset? Or why are my children so dysregulated? And the reality is that I believe from day one, if I am a coercive controller, I have been insidiously harming and trying to diminish the foundation of trust that your children have with you from day one. The issue is that I may never have to exert that. It's kind of like, you get your soldiers ready for battle. And when you're getting your soldiers ready for battle, they're just ready. And so at the time the departure, the escape finally happens, victims and survivors, that's when they begin to see, oh my gosh, what's been going on all this time since day one. No question about it. And so what I realized in my own situation is that I was a clinician and I was seeing my children really like questioning who was the truth teller, who was not the truth teller. And I realized that my best offense was not to be defensive, was not to play into the false narration that the coercive controller was dying for me to play into, was dying to really ignite a fire in me so that I would be really upset. And what I realized is I needed to really be really calm and really in a position of personal power, so that when my children came to me and expressed a horrible thing about me, I was able to clearly say, it's not true, sweetheart. And it came from a place of personal power. And that's hard as a trauma victim. Let's be really clear, Billy. Like when you're in trauma mode and your children are triggering you, I'm not suggesting this is easy stuff. This is really hard stuff. But I started to notice a shift. And that's what I teach protective parents, is that we can slowly shift our environment, even if we only see our children for an hour a week. I have moms who literally saw shifts in an hour at lunch in another state because the father had, through family law, left the state with the children, and be able to shift and really saw remarkable changes eventually. And so it's about how we parent. Our children are not just trauma victims. They are coercive control victims. That's what they are. They are child abuse. If they came home with the amount of indoctrination that happens every time our children go to this person's house, the false narrative they're hearing, everything that's going on, if they came home and that looked like bruises, they would be covered. They would be covered with bruises, and we would treat them differently because we would be so horrified at the bruising they had. I'm suggesting the bruising is internal, and it happens. It's literally nonstop. So, yeah.
Okay, so what I think I'm hearing you say, I just want to make sure. What I think I'm hearing you say is when, children of divorce go back and forth between two houses of two people who are at war with one another when they're going through a divorce. And many, many, many times they are hearing from both parties how awful the other party is.
Mm-hmm.
And are you saying that when children are experiencing that as part of their divorce, one of those parties is abusive, or are you saying both of those parties are abusive?
I'm suggesting that if I have been trapped for years with a coercive controller,
right,
and I am a trauma victim, and that is abuse, and then I leave that person, and then that person is saying horrible things about me, but when the children are coming to me, I am retaliating. I am such a trauma victim that I'm retaliating. It kind of goes back to the Amber Heard case. Like if we
can totally talk about that.
So if we look at the dynamics of that
Yeah.
case and the foundation of that case,
Yeah.
and a lot of people don't agree with me, and that's fine. We can agree to disagree. There was one person in a position of power. And so the question becomes for me is that if let's just say a father is retaliating because he's been trapped for years, I'll use the dads in this case, right? He's been trapped for years and he's retaliating. That's his trauma response. What he has to learn is if he wants to be the healthy, protective parent, he cannot do that.
Right.
He cannot do that. That's
Right.
not helpful to our children. My point is that doesn't mean my suggestion is this is not about high conflict or two people at war. This is about one person who is an abuser, probably, and that the other person is so triggered and overwhelmed that they actually may behave kind of like that abuser, even though they're not that abuser at all. It's
Right.
a trauma response.
Right.
So to your point, the assumption is that a healthy protective parent is going to be trauma informed
Yeah.
and understand that they cannot behave anything like that other parent, because when they do, here's the key. When I behave anything like that other parent, the child has no clarity on where
Right.
they're safe.
Absolutely.
None.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I can just affirm in what you're saying is that even if you slip, even if you imply or you make a snide remark about that abusive parent, even that is confusing and detrimental and harmful to children. It
Correct.
sucks.
Correct. Because, so let's just like, if I have been since day one being indoctrinated with a false narrative my whole life against one parent, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about coercive control now. We are
Mhm.
talking about abuse, right?
Mhm.
And if that's been happening my whole life and I don't trust you, you're the protective parent, but I've been taught not to trust you. I mean, it's the most significant betrayal trauma. I am betrayed by a coercive controller because if I go against that person, there will be such ramifications.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I'm betrayed by my protective parent, not because they betrayed me, but because I've been told they are a betrayer.
Mhm.
Okay. So the foundation of trust is annihilated. I've got no foundation of trust. And so if that protective parent cannot be consistently showing up the correct way,
Mhm.
what happens with trust? You know what happens with trust.
Right.
For
Easily
years,
broken.
easily broken, easily
Mhm.
broken. And so it's almost like you do have to be pretty much set up to be very consistently someone that they know they can trust. And by the way, they're always trying to test you.
Right.
So it's not easy because they're testing you all of the time in all of this. They're calling you horrible names, maybe, or they're saying they hate being here, or they hate living with you. They're hurting you personally. And I always say, nothing they say is personal. It's a projection of their pain. It's
And
a
what they've
significant,
heard. I mean, I
of
know
course.
parents who literally hear out of their children's mouths the same words they're getting emailed to them by their ex. And you know that came from your ex through your
100%.
children's mouths. Of course it's triggering.
Of
So
course.
there's so much we could talk about, and you're going to be on my podcast, and I can't wait to explore all these things with you, but all of these people are waiting to ask you questions. So Kendra, if you just want to unmute people one at a time, or if people want to ask their questions, put it in the chat so we know you've got a question, and then we'll unmute you and you can ask Dr. Cocchiola.
And can I just add something that's so important?
Please.
Because I think it's just important there's two things. One is that Dr. Evan Stark, who upheld the term coercive control, talks about it being like the foundation of a house. You don't even know the carpenter ants are infesting it. Like it literally just falls apart underneath you. And then all of a sudden you have a moment. And so there's that, but also that there's a difference between giving your children clarity and disparaging the other parent. And I can talk about that because you can call out behaviors, and it doesn't even have to be your ex's behaviors. Our role as protective parents is to continually teach our children about healthy boundaries, unhealthy boundaries, toxic relationships, not toxic relationships. What is coercive control? What isn't it? And if you're not doing, I call it the CIA, we have to be creative about it. We have to be intentional about it, and we have to be authentically attuned to our children. And so that means working really hard to give them clarity without saying something bad about that other person.
Yeah, which seems impossible. I mean, but that's why I'm so happy that you teach what you teach. Kendra, do you want to let us know what our first question is?
Yeah, give me just a second. Okay, so we have a friend on the chat who is going by parent, and their question is following. My child is in counseling. The child has no behavioral issues, and I'm afraid to really open up to the counselor about everything of how I feel the other parent's behavior is affecting her because he manipulates everyone. He has already manipulated one counselor. She was eventually fired for the private communications he had with the other parent, but the damage was already done. I spoke up during trial and was re-traumatized during the entire case and then abused once again by the judge because I brought up the psychological abuse. So now I'm even more afraid to speak up. What is the best way to bring the attention to the issue without the counselor turning it around on me?
Sure. So a couple of things I would say. First of all, I want to try to help everyone with the vernacular. So when we talk about psychological abuse, we're talking about one facet of abuse, and really coercive control is all of these facets. So if we can start using coercive control, we're going to actually help educate everyone. That's how I see it. So coercive control is psychological abuse, but it's that legal abuse that young woman or that mother has experienced. It's the financial abuse we know 99% of victims suffer, right? It's the use of the children. We know that's happening in this situation. And sometimes it can be sexual abuse too. So let's really try to hone in on the topic that it's all about one person exerting power and control over another person. It's about having power over, and what I want protective moms to have is personal power. He has diminished you so much and stripped away your autonomy that even in your own home with your children, you may not have personal power. And then you go into the court system and you have a judge admonish you. You go into therapy, you have a therapist who doesn't see it clearly. And I'll tell you, as a therapist, I had my own therapist who minimized my experiences in my relationship dynamic. And certainly, as soon as we start talking about it, oftentimes there is this misunderstanding. And I'm not suggesting all therapists, but that's why I've created a clinician training. I'm trying to train clinicians on what this looks like. I'm trying to train coaches. It's really about education. So I would say that this is why I created the protective parenting program. This is the number one reason, besides my children, is because I realized that when my children would go to therapy, their experiences were being diminished. And when you go to therapy once a week for an hour. That's it. When you're home with me and I am trauma informed and I am teaching you about these things, giving you clarity, and I know you are a victim of domestic abuse, you are a victim of child abuse. I know that. As your protective parent, I have the most influence of anybody. Think about that. Think about how much power a protective parent has in her own home if she simply understands all of these nuances and looks at it. I always say this, we look at it from the perspective that they're not our child, but that they're someone else's child that we are supporting. Because when we say they're our child, we're triggered by them. If there's someone else's child, we might respond differently. So to the answer is this. I actually have on my website a list of what to ask therapists before hiring them. And it's a guideline on how to hire therapists or anybody else that's going to be engaged in your court process. But I would say that it's very important that when we explain our circumstances, we are a victim, but we do not come across as a victim, because we don't know if the other party is going to have any empathy for that, if they don't get it. And honestly, I don't understand. I think that's part of the problem. I think if you haven't lived in this world of being oppressed and no one recognizes the oppression, that it's really hard to recognize. So therapists are trained to be empathic, but they may not actually get it. They just might not get it. So what can we do? We can say, I just want to be clear that I lived in be very succinct. We don't want to overwhelm. We want to be concrete about it, very succinct, and we want to come from a position of personal power. 3 statements. What are your 3 statements? I was in the relationship was very toxic. I believe that my child is feeling very torn in this situation. I feel my child's feeling very overwhelmed. These are the behaviors I am seeing from my child, and I am concerned for my child. Make it very clear that it is about your child. It is not about your experiences, and only have one statement about the toxicity. Once we go down the road of domestic abuse, I am sorry to say, people turn off their headset. They literally stop listening, and it's very sad. And I'm just being blunt here. It sucks.
Yeah.
But that's really what we have to do. And I say that if you have a child who's having trouble in school, you go to one trusted school professional, the one you think might get it. You share with them 3 major things. 3, that's it. Not as you as a victim. This was a toxic situation in our family system. We're divorcing. It's gotten worse. I'm worried about my child. I see their grades are suffering. I'm hopeful you can meet with them once a week and just connect with them because they are feeling really torn. That's 3 things, very succinct. You go to one person. If they are a good person, they will share it with other people. But the story will not be that you came in as a victim and and that the story is similar to his because he's probably gotten flying monkeys involved in the process. The story is very clear. It's a long answer.
What is so important about what you said is I watch so many victims of domestic abuse just want to be believed. And they spend so much money and so much time and so much energy trying to convince people that they are indeed a victim. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. The reason why they do it is because they are always in self-doubt mode, because that's exactly what he wanted.
Right.
He wanted the victim to always question themselves. That's what he did in the home all the time, right? So it makes sense that people will question themselves. But I would say this, the coping mechanism for many victims and survivors is to over-explain.
Yes.
Because they learned in that relationship that they would be accused falsely of things, that they would certainly need to over apologize. If we look at Biderman's coercion chart, he did it in 1957. He actually investigated prisoners of war in communist China. It was Korea during the Korean War, but it was under communist regime. And what he saw is that victims in these prisoners of war they could be so readily worn down. And that's what I would say about our domestic abuse victims, is that you're so worn down that you'll do anything to resolve the problem. So you tend to over explain. That is a bad, quote unquote, bad habit you've created. That's a boundary issue. Nobody deserves for you to have to explain yourself. And the problem is, to your point, Billy, is that we go into schools and we're meeting with the school principal and we over-explain.
Well, and that goes back to the therapist question. You don't have to convince the therapist that your ex is the bad guy. You have to help your children. And maybe the therapist is part of that and maybe not.
Right. And and to your point, you don't have to convince that he's the bad guy. You have to convince the therapist that you are the good guy.
Sure. And the best way to do that is to show up and not talk about what happened. But this is so hard.
Right. And so I would say, again, you could say that it was a toxic relationship. And then if you have a therapist, listen, most victims and survivors are highly intuitive. Highly intuitive. We're empathic to a fault. So, if you get an inclination that this therapist might get it, honestly, a good therapist will say, can we sit down and talk about your family system? When I had clients, I'd say, okay, let's sit down and talk. I want to meet with your mom and your dad and talk about the family system. Get the perspective. The perpetrator would walk in the room. I'd start to hear the story and I'd be like, oh, I know who the abuser is.
Right.
And so then from there, we help the children to gain clarity without saying dad is bad, but understanding boundaries. Right. And so, I've had many clients where it's a matter of the child doesn't know who the protective parent is. Do I say your dad's a bad guy? No, but we begin to help them gain clarity on what the difference is and where they feel safe. But we can't do that if the protective parent's all over the place.
Right.
And over explaining. Yeah.
So can we do a little role play here?
Sure.
I'll be the kid and you be the parent we're supposed to be. Okay.
Okay.
So the kid comes to you and they might be saying things like, I don't know, let's pick a topic. Pick a topic that you see a lot.
You took all the money.
Sure. You took all of dad's money and now we can't go out to eat and you spend all this money on yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So I have an acronym for this. It's called VEST K21. Okay. So VEST is validate. E is empathize. S is soft tone. ST is soft tone. And then with kindness, we do a 2.1. I'll explain it. Okay. So Sweetheart, I'm so sorry that you think that. It's not true. Now it's 2.1. That's one. Come back to me now. Come back and give me another.
Dad said it is true. He has to pay child support of $2,000 a month. That's $2,000 a month that he can't use to take care of us.
Sweetheart, I'm sorry. That's just not true. It's not true. Now come back at me again.
Are you saying that you don't get $2,000 from Dad? He said he pays you. Is he lying?
You know what? How about if we talk about this later? But I told you it's not true. And so what I just did is I didn't over explain. I didn't get involved. So this is really important. This is actually like a whole nother pivot, but the coercive controller, these people want their children. Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Okay. These children do not want their children to be, to have agency, just like they didn't want you to have agency.
Mhm.
And so they really try to make your children anxious, really anxious. We know anxiety is like one of the number one factors these children have, and they manifest it in a variety of ways. And so they want your child to be really anxious. And if they can do that, then they can continue to control your child. I want you to think about a puppeteer, right? Like, I mean, literally, this is how they compromise your children. And this is how they can create mini thems. This is like, it's scary, but this is how we create a generation of people who really don't have so much shame and discomfort with who they are that they then project this by wanting control over others. Okay, I know that's a lot, but to answer the question, so in that, I don't over explain, because if I over explain, I am feeding the unhealthy part of my child's ego that the coercive controller wants to grow. So what we do is we disengage, we give them validation, we empathize with them, but we give ourselves a ceiling of 2. I'm only going to say it twice. It's not true. It's not true, honey. And when they come back at me the third time, I'm going to disengage with kindness. Now that might be, you know what? Mom just got a phone call. We can talk about this later if you want. And we disengage, or we can say, do you want to talk about this at 6 o'clock tonight after dinner? Or we can say, I've got to go take a shower right now, sweetheart. We can talk about this later, or we're done talking about this now. But what we've done is we've shut down the conversation and told them very clearly, it's not true. Now, if I say it's not true, and then I start explaining myself, I lose all credibility. I lose all credibility. The only way I stand, I mean, we know research from sociologists I'm a sociology professor too. And when criminals go in to like defend themselves, the best way to defend yourself is to not talk a lot.
Say nothing.
And so you're not a criminal, but what your child will hear is it's not true. And that they haven't gotten you into their tornado vortex that the coercive controller has instructed them to do, by the way. They've been given direct orders.
Let's say Dad shows the child the $2,000 withdrawal from his account, and you said it's not true, and now the child is just getting more information that it is true.
Well, then it is true. Well, then it is true.
Dad pays you child support.
Correct. He does.
Okay. So if that was accurate and you were getting the child support, how would that change the role play?
Yeah. So yes, honey, your father, never call him daddy ever if he is an abuser. Never. That creates too much affection and personalization. Create as much by being polite, create as much separation. Your father does pay child support. Or yes, I receive child support, sweetheart.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you're just going to either shut down the lie as that's not true and not engage.
I'm going to lay out the truth. I am going to lay out the truth.
If it is true, yes, there is child support. You're not going to go into how the court calculated the child support.
Well, how old are they? I'll tell you, my son was 19 and at college, and his dad kept telling him he was paying for his tuition, and he wasn't. His dad was making me financially broke, and I was doing whatever I could to keep my child in college. I finally did at 19 open up the computer, and he insisted that there must be something wrong with my checking account. So we went on to the computer of his college, and I showed the transactions, and we added them up, and there it was. You know, at
Sure.
19, I did that. If they're
Yeah.
12, you can say, mom does not lie.
Yeah.
And this money is what the court decided mom needs
Uh-huh.
so that I can provide the best home I can for you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm glad we clarified that. Kendra, do we have another question?
We don't. I just want to remind everybody that you are welcome to ask questions. Please keep yourself on mute. The way that it'll work is if you go to your reactions and just raise your hand. I'll see it pop up, and then I can unmute you and we can start that conversation. We got a lot of people in here, which is amazing. So go
Well,
ahead.
I have lots
and...
of questions, so I'm happy that they're not.
Oh, cool. Well,
Okay.
if we get one, I'll let you know. But you guys
Thank
are good
you.
to keep going. Yeah.
All right. So, are all toxic relationships coercive and controlling?
Well, toxic relationships makes the assumption there's two people that are toxic. So the answer to that, I believe, would be no. I mean, that's just my flippant response from shooting from the hip. I mean, so that's the problem. We use the words high conflict. I mean, in my opinion, high conflict is BS. I mean, because it's not high conflict. There's one person. Rosenfeld did a study with colleagues in 2019. There is one person drawn towards conflict. It's a person who has a characterological disorder, who needs to exert power and control over others in order to feel the state. Honestly, the court becomes their stage. They are elated to be in court. They revel in the ability to show up in a certain way as a charlatan. And so the answer is that if there's toxicity in your relationship, are you contributing? I don't think so. I would say that most often, when a victim behaves in a toxic way, we'll say in an inappropriate way, oftentimes it's after years of being trapped. Or months of being trapped. If I've been in a relationship for so long and I've been gaslit into believing that there's not infidelity, I've been gaslit into believing there's a certain amount of money, I've been gaslit into believing I need to work more hours, all of these things. And then finally, like this person who continually maybe locks me in the laundry room to have a discussion or is always late, and they come home late that third time and I'm starting to get clarity, I might react. And that's called self-defense, not reactive abuse. It's called self-defense. And so really, when you have been so bottled up and oppressed for so long, it sounds a little bit, I want to ask the question, when we are in an intimate terrorism situation, this is intimate terrorism. You are literally, your brain is so harmed. There is all kinds of chemical reactions going on that are changing your brain system and your child's and your children's, that this harm changes you. You are a trauma victim. If you have been trapped in the den with a wolf, do you fight back sometimes? Of course you do. Of course you do. So was the wolf toxic? Yeah. Were you toxic when you fought back? No, you were defending yourself. That's how I see it.
This is where things get really, really tricky, right? And this is why the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case, captivated people. It was such a show. And it was an interesting case because it was a defamation case. So Johnny Depp sued Amber Heard for defamation because she claimed to be a domestic abuse victim. And then we had this sideshow of a trial about who did what in the relationship. And what I saw very clearly was that both parties demonstrated that both of them inflicted actual acts of violence on one another. Is that the way you see it?
Well, sure, I do. But I mean, let's just talk about the age difference. Let's talk about the amount of money one person had. Let's talk about the fact that one person chose to have a public trial to shame someone. Let's talk about the threat. Let's talk about the threats made that if you actually make this a big deal, then I will definitely bring this forward and you will never, ever, you will regret it for the rest of your life. That's coercive control. That is, so did Amber behave in ways that we would all agree were inappropriate? Yes. Was she feeling trapped? I believe 100% yes. Did we have people on the stand who actually went to dinner at his house before the trial to meet with him to get hired? That is an egregious ethical violation. You know that as an attorney. I mean, there was so much wrong.
Right.
That I get that she behaved badly, but why are women held to a different standard than men? Let's talk about patriarchy.
Right.
Let's talk about gender depression. I mean, why are women held to a different, why is it that a mother does one thing wrong? She reacts wrongly.
Right.
One time, and
Right.
she's held to account, and a man can do 9 wrong things and
Right.
he's not held to account. Why do you think the rates of domestic abuse, when you go on the national, I'm a board member of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You go on there and it says, I think 1 in 8 men are victims of domestic abuse. Did you know that if I have been trapped over and over again, and there's been several calls to the police and there is a criminal record, and then the one time that I push back, the police come out and now my perpetrator is a victim.
Absolutely. And that is a reality of what I see happen in family court all the time. It is so unusual that you'll ever have someone who's behaved perfectly. And so what I see happen with doctors who do comprehensive family assessments and court-appointed advisors and judges is they'll make the finding both parties were abusive to one another. It cancels each other out. Even if you've got 100 on one side and 2 on the other.
Right.
It's awful.
Right. And I mean, the Saunders study exposed this and said that people who work in the court, when he did his research in 2011, what he found is that there is a belief in hierarchy. There is a belief that women lie. There is a belief that, if a woman has been abused, the children are fine. It's really, we need to just focus on the children. And so it's really an endemic problem. And it's definitely related to patriarchal norms. And we have women and men in the court system who are not doing a good job of advocating for victims and survivors, who don't understand it. And frankly, I say, is it ignorance that they don't understand it? Okay, so allow us to teach you. What we need to do is really push this envelope of understanding the character issues of these perpetrators, because as soon as you understand who they really are, you understand what they look like in court. And so if we could do that, we could really support victims and survivors on a much greater level. But I also it sounds crazy, but maybe not crazy, but this idea that are there people in the system who are using the system to coercively control?
For sure.
It's institutional betrayal when a mother loses custody or loses her share of custody, whether she had 70 and now she has 30, to a person who was a perpetrator and we're clear that they were a perpetrator. That's just such significant betrayal. And I will just go on one more time and one more moment here and just say that if a child has a history of being with one parent 70% of the time before the divorce, 70% of the time, and they are, this parent does everything for them because that's the role. They're the manager of the house, this parent, typically mothers. Then why would we ever take that away? Children in development actually need that attachment as much as possible. By stripping that away and going to 50-50, by stripping that away and flipping it because someone is the moneyed parent and they have more money to pay for things. And we could even get into discussion about collusion in the court, right? This idea that what is psychologically best for children? It's best for children to be with the parent they've been with most of the time. And in a healthy separation or divorce, the parents know that. They're not trying to weaponize custody to harm the other parent. That's what we would expect the courts to know. That if she had them 70% of the time, the kids belong with her 70% of the time. I mean, I had kids going back and forth every other day. They don't know where they're, at 4 or 8 or 10 or 12 years old, that's just way too traumatic for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole topic that we could talk about for a million years. And it's an interesting one. And I'm not sure how I feel. I'm really not, because I watch families restructure post-divorce, and sometimes they do that in a really great way.
Mhm.
But I also don't disagree with anything that you're saying. And some families do restructure in that way, where they decide we're going to continue what the status quo was, but most don't. And sometimes it seems to be a very healthy transition, and other times it isn't. And I don't know what the difference is.
Well, I think the variable might be for some is that there's coercive control involved, right? And that's when the dynamic, when it shifts that way, it's just not healthy at all for anyone, right? I mean, children who are being coercively controlled when they're visiting one parent are so dysregulated in various ways. It doesn't have to show up as being angry. In various ways, when they're coming home, that protective parent is now contending with that.
Right.
And what the children benefit from more time with the safe parent. They just do. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple questions here. I saw a couple hands raised. I see Sarah, and then there was somebody before Sarah. Kendra, do you know who that was?
I didn't see anybody. I've been monitoring. If you did raise your hand, go ahead and do it again. I've got a list running, so we will get to you. Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and then Tawny will get to you next. Okay, Sarah, you are all good.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, I'm sorry I joined a little bit late, but I'm wondering about the coercive control, if it is possible to be a silent thing. In my situation, I am very much an information person, and I have 50-50, and dad continues to say that I'm being controlling, which I try very hard not to be controlling in any way, shape, or form. But I also think that communication between households is important. He often, almost probably 95% of the time, prefers to have the kids communicate anything to me instead of him directly talking to me. And then avoids any kind of written communication when I've asked for, trying to change a schedule or trying to switch a weekend or buying things financially for the kids at school, things like that. And there's so much avoidance, which has been his MO even when we were married, and passiveness. But then I'm being pinned as the controlling person when I'm really just trying to be informative and helpful. And so I want to avoid, being controlling in any way, shape, or form, but I'm also, it's a weird feeling. And I'm just wondering about that, if you have any input on that.
Absolutely. So first of all, I would say stop being so helpful. You're not working with someone who's collaborating with you. This is not co-parenting, right? This is not. You are parenting your children, I say, alone. You're not even a single parent. You have to look at it that way, that this is all on you. And I know it sounds to me like he's Darvoing you. So he's the controller, but he's denying, attacking, and reversing victim and offender. That's called Darvo. Jennifer Fried came up with that in 1997, and it works very well in domestic abuse. We see this happening all of the time. I would also say he's stonewalling you. That's like a telltale sign of coercive control. That's what narcissistic abusers do. People call them narcissists, right? This is a telltale sign. He's stonewalling you. So stop communicating. And frankly, if the money is an issue, the bottom line is that, some people have had to walk away from everything in order to gain peace. Now, that may not be possible for you. I'm not suggesting that, but that may be, maybe he doesn't help with school uniforms anymore. Maybe you just figure it out. Maybe you start, I don't know, moonlighting a little bit extra so that you can take care of that, because every interaction you're having is being used against you. And here you are, by the way, you said that you're just trying to be helpful. I promise you, I know exactly what you're talking about. This is what we do. This is what we did in the relationship. We accommodated. We tried really hard. We're fixers. We're loyal to a fault. We're givers in relationships. Stop being so helpful. Put a boundary in.
That's really, really great advice. I love it. Tawny, let's go over to you. What's your question?
Hi, yeah, I had a question about going back to your kids being in therapy. I want to check out that list that you have, but my son is in therapy right now because he has an adjustment disorder. It took me about 2 years to get father to agree to actually put him in counseling after he was diagnosed with that adjustment disorder. We have 50-50. Once he finally agreed, he still is refusing to pay his half for it. And I had actually met with this counselor prior to kind of inform her about the fact that I think there is coercive control, possible narcissism, and it's been a really toxic relationship for the past decade. And that my son was starting to show signs of not wanting to be with his father or saying things that were going on in the home that he didn't like. She kind of started out, not to say she was on my side, but more of, okay, I will be aware with what he says, with manipulation tactics, all of those things. As when she met him and as counseling has continued, she's actually started to kind of turn the tables, and it almost seems like there's more of a favoring towards father. Like, I can see that he's got her in his grips, almost, I guess you could say. And there's a lot of hard questions coming towards me, or a lot of criticism coming towards me about what I'm lacking or I'm not doing. I did have some recorded calls of what my son was saying, and I asked her to listen, hear him out, just kind of see what the child was saying, because we're here for the child. All she really did in that regard is just bring father in and try and get us to co-parent. When I said that, at the beginning, there had been I think there was emotional abuse and verbal abuse. What would be your recommendation? Does this sound like counseling I should continue for my son, or with this counselor, or possibly look at something else? I'm just kind of thrown for a loop on it.
Sure. So I would say that it feels to me like she's betraying you, to be very clear. And a lot of times when I mentioned some of the reasons why, like, people don't listen to the victim who has, experienced this, it also can be fair. I mean, a lot of these perpetrators have threatened licenses of therapists. They certainly, there is an awareness of the power that the coercive controller has. And that creates a level of fear oftentimes for perhaps helping professions, whether it's a guardian ad litem. That's why we hear guardian ad litems always give 50, or actually custody evaluators always give 50-50, even if there's been a series of abuse experiences, because A, they won't get hired again. And B, because there is a fear of retaliation. Now, let me add in what I said before, or C, or this would be A, they're ignorant and being jerks because they're not they're not trying to protect, they're not doing their job. And I believe that they are exerting coercive control. So they have, in my opinion, maybe some minor level characterological issues if they're not willing to stand up for victims and survivors. But that's a whole nother conversation. Adjustment disorder, for me, whenever I have a client who has OCD. The child has obsessive compulsive behaviors. I hear, of course, anxiety, depression, adjustment disorder. All of these, for me, when I hear, when there is an awareness that this coercive control has been happening in the family system, and I don't know how long you were married to this person and how long he lived in the home, but if your child was disclosing to you, or you heard in some way that your child didn't even want to necessarily go visit with, or was, uncomfortable, and then there's these verbal assaults that your child is aware of, I truly believe that this is much more what Dr. Bessel van der Kolk talks about. And unfortunately, it's not considered a diagnosis, but developmental trauma disorder. It's not actually recognized per se, but when children grow up in homes like this, and Bessel also talked about it as children being witnesses of, I think we even need to take it a step further. They are child abuse victims. They are traumatized from the tension they felt in the home. They had to regulate their behaviors. They knew that the protective parent had to regulate her behaviors. There is all of this anxiety that creates a significant dysregulation, which of course is going to come out and manifest in adjustment. And so I would say these children are not their chronological age ever. Developmentally, they can catch up, but developmentally, they're so harmed, their brains, there's physiological changes in the brain, and that they are so harmed that they have trauma. That's what they have. And so for me, if a therapist is sabotaging your child's health by making you, A, go to co-parenting with them, and B, making your child repair with that parent, then the therapy is not worth it. That's exactly, again, why I created the protective parenting program, because the best person to help your son is you. That's my answer.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think it also goes back to when parents are trying to look to be proven right, or get somebody to believe them, or get somebody to intercede on their behalf. Nobody's going to intercede on your behalf. We live in a patriarchy. It's messed up. It's not going to change. Nobody in the system is going to see things the same way you do. And so, like, not looking anymore and just focusing on how can I protect myself and my child is your best bet. And that is exactly what the Protective Parent Program teaches. Can you tell us a little bit more about that before we wrap up today?
Sure. And I would just add to that there are good therapists out there. There are, but many people, especially if you haven't experienced this, you cannot remember how long your clients, remember how long you all stayed in these relationships. You had cognitive dissonance. You were trauma bonded, just like your children are, to that abuser. And so just like you took 10 years or 5 years or 20 years, or in my case, 30 some odd years to figure it out, it's the same way with therapists. They can't wrap their head around it. A lot of people can't believe there's actually evil in this world. And frankly, there is. So yeah, I actually have a podcast that just launched called Perfect Prey, because I believe that people who are characterologically disordered actually prey upon certain people, and they prey upon the victims and survivors that I know so well. And so if you want to check that out on Apple and Spotify, and also the Protective Parenting Program, I have a self-study option. I have one-on-one coaching, but also in it, you meet with me once a week, and we go over, it's 8 modules of work. And there's also a prep module, 180 pages of workbooks, and about 12 hours of lessons, where I really teach you what you need to be doing in the home. And we also address your own trauma. And this whole process is such a significant grief. It's a significant grieving process. And we talk about that too. So
I have a client who went through this program, and she was coming out of a really horrific divorce, a really horrific relationship. He was horribly abusive, and she, of course, had to share parenting time, and she was a great parent to start with. But the tools that she gained from your program really set her free. Set her free from feeling like she needed to explain herself, or feeling like she needed to counter, or prove that he was wrong. It was really, really amazing to watch as a lawyer, and it helped her tremendously.
I appreciate that. I really believe in it, and created it because I just know that the best influence for children is their protective parent.
So we have two questions. So sorry, we got a bunch of questions towards the end, and I just want to get, there's 2 that are clarity questions. So the first one is from Christina. She wants to make sure that she has the name of the disorder correct, because she wants to learn more about it. Is it called developmental trauma disorder?
Sure. Bessel van der Kolk talks about it in his book, The Body Keeps Score. He tried to have it approved by the American Psychological Association in replacing ADHD, not replacing it entirely, but oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, which are really like they scaffold together, not always, but they can scaffold together. And he received pushback. And I believe a lot of that is because I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the DSM, because a lot of these people who make these diagnoses are people in positions of power, and they use these diagnoses to pathologize people. And I believe they're pathologizing our children for sure, and victims and survivors. But that being said, developmental trauma disorder at least addresses this idea that there is trauma in the history. So yeah, you might really appreciate it. I will warn you that, again, he says children are witnesses. I say children are they're victims.
Did you have another clarification before we wrap up, Kendra?
Yeah, the last one that came in was just a question about the appropriate age for children to start the program.
It's not for children, it's for the mothers, protective parents. Yes.
Got you. Cool.
Yeah, and your children can be any age. I have moms who have children who are 25, and it's helped. I have moms too. I always say the younger that we can create the space in our home that really is coercive control, trauma informed, that lens in our home, the younger that we can do this with our children, the better off the circumstances will be.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions. You have been an amazing guest. I cannot wait to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. It was just a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think people are asking where to find me. So probably the best way is iknowyourheart.com. I'm coercive control consulting, but if you just look up I Know Your Heart, because protective moms know their children's hearts better than anybody.
Love that. I love that. Thank you all. Have an amazing, wonderful day.